Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from our cheese cave here, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company in the building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. Today's episode is made possible by thanks to generous support from our friends at Diamond V. We have an exciting episode planned this week as we work through Dairy is a Powerhouse. For those of you with outstanding memories, this episode is a follow-up to our widely viewed Dairy Livestream webcast that aired July 9th and bore the same name. Today's guests will help us navigate how retailers and food service customers are continuing to fill food pipelines during the ongoing pandemic and how consumers are reacting during the pandemic by shifting purchasing patterns. As a prelude to our first guest, we're going to go straight to a poll question. Our producer, Jim Baltz, will put that up there for everyone to participate. The question will read, what percent are in-store dairy sales up when compared to the pre-pandemic period? So we're thinking March 2020 and earlier and comparing it to our most recent information from late September to early October. Your answers are 0.9%, 9%. 19 or 29. So go ahead and enter those. I know that some people do this as a podcast and they can't see the screen, but many of you are also online, so you can go ahead and do that. And so, Jim, when you feel comfortable, you can go ahead and wrap that poll up. And the correct answer is B as in boy, 31%. So some people are thinking it's up a little bit more. And our first guest, John Crawford, will delve deeper into that dairy topic. John has seen dairy from many sides of the dairy case, having served as assistant marketing manager for Land O'Lakes with focus on deli cheese, butter, and new product innovation. He later served as director of innovation and head of marketing for Crystal Farms, that has an extensive cheese and dairy product line and also works in the egg category. These days, John is vice president of client insights for dairy at IRI. John, what has been taking place in the dairy case during the pandemic?
Well, thank you very much, Corey, for having me. I'm really looking forward to joining this esteemed panel. So dairy and total store has actually been COVID has been a boon for retail grocery. As consumers have had to, shift their purchase behaviors, shift their eating behaviors, right? The economy shut down. Restaurants for sure were hit very, very hard, and grocery saw a real boon as folks started to cook from home and eat from home. I'm gonna do a couple of different time periods here. The first one we're gonna do is we're gonna segment time periods into 4 phases. One is the pre-pandemic period, which is the 8 weeks kind of leading up to the end of February. And then I'm going to look at the panic buy period, which is really a concentrated 2-week period around mid-March. And then we'll look at the shelter at home period, which is basically the end of March till mid-May. And then the reopening period, and that depends on obviously where you are, from mid-May until now October 4th is the latest data that we have. We're going to look at all multi-outlet plus convenience. So just so you kind of understand that. And I'm going to be talking dollar sales. I know Mike's going to talk a little bit of units. So you get the best of both worlds there. Total store sales, and this is average weekly sales, before the pandemic, pre-pandemic was about $16 billion. During the pandemic timeframe, the panic buy timeframe, we added $8.2 billion of sales per week. So 52% growth versus the prior year. During shelter at home, it was $2.4 billion. Of growth over the pre-pandemic period, and now reopening, it's still $2 billion higher than it was during the pre-pandemic period. So we're still seeing tremendous growth over where we were leading up to the pandemic. Most of that is driven by edibles. We take our total store and divide it into edibles versus non-edibles. Edibles it was at $10 billion, saw $5.6 billion during the panic buy, $2 billion of increased sales during shelter at home, and $1.5 billion worth of sales during the reopening period. And we saw big increases in frozen and also in center of store, as we started to see those two categories that were not quite performing as well started to perform well as consumers started to kind of really look towards foods that maybe they hadn't been looking to before, and a little bit longer shelf life foods. Dairy, and we define we define it as the dairy 15. So there's 15 categories that make up the dairy for us at IRI. It's the traditional dairy categories. We exclude eggs from it because it tends to skew the data. So if you're an egg producer here, I apologize for that. We add in refrigerated dips and refrigerated desserts, and then we add in ice cream and frozen novelties. So we're mainly looking at categories that have, basically dairy, dairy cow producing products. For the dairy 15, it was at $1.3 billion. It added, it added $600 million. It went up to $1.9 billion in that panic buy period. It added $300 million in the shelter at home period and $200 million a week during the reopening period. And so the question that Andy correctly asked me was, well, how much of this, you're talking dollar sales, how much of this was due to pricing issues? And I can tell you that some, not all. When we look at pricing during these same time periods, I'll just talk dairy 15 for now. But dairy 15 versus the year before, during the panic buy, during the pre-period, so during the increase that we saw pre-COVID, during the panic buy, dollar sales, pricing was up 4.5% versus before. During shelter at home, it was up 7.2%, and now it's kind of settled back down at up 3.2%. So yes, there's been some pricing increases. It hasn't been as prevalent as you would have necessarily thought. I'm going to take a quick shift now, and we're going to look at a couple of different time periods. So we looked at pre-shelter at home, post. One thing that we also wanted to look at was how did it trend kind of by region? We know that reopening and closing was at different time frames, and we really didn't see any differences across our IRI 8 regions. So it really, the trends, when you layer on the growth trends, the lines are completely almost on top of each other. And so the trends are almost identical to each other. So we know that Florida opened early, but the Southeast didn't necessarily see different trends. The panic buy happened at the same time. The shelter at home increased. And then the reopening increase was pretty much the same. We did see a nice bump for grocery. So when we break down our channels into grocery and mass, now we're going to look at 52 weeks ending the end of February versus 52 weeks ending the beginning of October. Food grew at 13.5 points. So grocery saw a 13.5% point increase. Mass with Walmart was up 5.5 points. Convenience was actually down. It's actually down from where it was pre-pandemic period. And drug is also actually down from where it was pre-pandemic. So grocery, and I know Michael will talk to that on Kroger, was really saw the boon of consumers shifting their purchases back to grocery versus going to mass or super centers. One quick look before we dive into the dairy 15. When we're looking at plant-based, and I know that's always a question, plant-based was outpacing across the dairy 15, was outpacing the category about 6 times leading up to the pandemic, leading up to the end of February. After that, it's only up 2.5 times. So dairy has seen a resurgence. Plant-based is still growing, and it's still growing faster than the category, but not as much as it was before. And now just to look at the dairy 15, just to kind of bucket into a couple categories. One of the things that we saw is that consumers have learned to, are cooking from home a lot more. And so you look at the categories that are kind of cooking categories, if you will. Butter saw a 16-point increase between the 52 weeks ending the end of February and the 52 weeks ending the beginning of October. Natural cheese, 14.4 points. Cream cheese up 12 points. Sour cream up 12 points. And milk up 7 points. So we saw some big increases across those kind of cooking categories as consumers really started to learn how to cook at home. And one of the things we're pretty interested in is hopefully, younger consumers have been kind of forced. We know that millennials and Gen Z typically didn't really cook at home, and they didn't know how to cook at home. That's an overgeneralization, I understand. But we do hope that the pandemic has actually led to consumers learning to cook from home, and that will continue after the trend. We did see processed foods, and we saw that in center store, but we also saw that as in terms of processed cheese and margarine. So both processed cheese and margarine had been declining categories for many, many years, and they were actually down in that pre-pandemic period. and saw some pretty healthy increases. So processed cheese actually saw a 15.1 point increase, and margarine saw about a 12-point increase. So we did see consumers starting to understand that, well, maybe processed foods are good for us during this time. We saw indulgent categories do pretty well, with ice cream and frozen novelties seeing some big increases. And then the interesting one is, and it makes a lot of sense, is yogurt. The yogurt category actually was the one Dairy 15 category that really didn't see a tremendous amount of increase. And we believe that's due to the large single serve basis of that category, and the lack of on-the-go eating occasions. So with workers working from home, with kids not going to school, we really feel that was because the on-the-go eating occasion was not as much. And I think Michael actually talked to a little bit about the multi-serve and the pints of yogurt starting to see some resurgence. So all in all, we saw some really good trends, and we're hoping that some of those trends stick around so dairy can continue to see this tremendous growth.
Thank you, John. So we're going to go couple of things here. If you hear questions or think of questions that you want to ask our panelists, go ahead and type those into the question panel of our GoToWebinar control panel there, and we will get those here and get those answered live in the second half of the program. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Diamond V, for bringing this week's Dairy Livestream to our audience. Before we invite our next guest to Dairy Livestream, we're going to go to another poll question, and like the teacher giving the answer out and before the test here, we'll see if everybody was listening here. What dairy product didn't see greater growth during the pandemic? Butter, natural cheese, processed cheese, or yogurt? So far, we are trending over 90% correct on this one. It's slipping a little bit, but people were listening, so we're doing pretty well here. We're gonna close this one off a little early here. We're over 50% already. Actually, you guys are quick on the switch. The correct answer is yogurt, and Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that. We welcome him back to Dairy Livestream. As I alluded to earlier, Mike appeared on our July 9th episode bearing the same name, and Mike certainly is a very unique individual in our dairy industry. He was a member of the Virginia Tech Dairy Judging Team in college. Ag economist, worked for National All Jersey 11 years, then went to Dairy Gold, where he headed up member services for the Pacific Northwest Dairy Cooperative, and then spent about 8 years with Glanbia. Now he's director of the dairy supply chain for the Kroger Company, and the Kroger Company is a top 2 grocer in the United States with over 2,700 stores. Mike, 2020 has to be the wildest ride in your dairy career. What have you been seeing in the recent months?
Incorrect forecasts is probably the thing we've seen the most week to week, both in volume and in price. It's been a crazy year. So we've seen a lot. And I looked at my data just a little bit different. I have basically a year to date. I have pre-COVID, which is January 1st to the 16th of March. And then I took what I call peak COVID and early recovery, which is March 17th to May 24th. Things really started to open up after that. And I picked that because out of stocks were an issue early on. We probably fared better than some because we run our own cheese cut and wrap plants. And that week of mid-March, we were out buying cheese like crazy to make sure we were covered for what we thought was going to happen. And thankfully, we looked kind of smart. And then I also have just the last 4 weeks, just to give us some idea. And what I'm going to talk about, because I'm not allowed to talk about dollars, but I can talk about percents all day long. So I'm going to talk about basically volumes, because if you're a dairy producer, how much stuff are we selling, I think is important. John did a beautiful job, and thankfully I'm going to basically agree with everything he said, but give you a little more Kroger perspective. So year to date, our total grocery sales are up about 11%. Dairy's a little better than that. And the mix of categories really depends. To give you some idea on total on peak grocery, and this is just food items. I didn't include, because if we'd include paper towels, toilet paper, and sanitizer, the number would be higher. Was up 18% for that basically 2-month period. Last 4 weeks we're still strong, but we're nowhere near 18. But we're looking at a very, very strong year, and there are some good signs. And one of the things that I find interesting is we go from peak COVID to the last few weeks. Dairy is still stronger than than it had been. So for example, last 4 weeks, fluids up 3.8%. We are up, still up about 1.5% on fluid milk sales, but overall sales are up, and they're up basically in 3 categories. They're up in cream. People must be injecting cream. I don't know how they're using it all, but butter, half and half, and whipping cream are up. Whipping cream is crazy. It's up 25% from a year ago. So it's been a very, very, very strong market. Again, I think obviously home baking, and I think part of it is some diet, particularly some of the keto and other diets are affecting that. The other thing we're seeing is extended shelf life milks, which in our case are mostly either organic or lactose free. Although we do sell actually aseptic pints and quarts across our 2,700 stores. Those continue to sell well. They sold like crazy during COVID because of shelf life. People wanted the longer shelf life. We could see they were making that preference moving back. Cultured products have been a really nice surprise. Pre-COVID, we were up already 3% for the year. We reached 16% year over year during peak COVID, and we're still up 9.5%. And it's across the category. It's cottage cheese, a lot of it's sour cream. The big star is ricotta. Again, that home baking thing. So someone's figuring out how to make lasagna at home, it appears, because ricotta sales are strong, and we definitely saw a high correlation between baked goods and what they bought in dairy. Because another example is butter. Butter has been the star as far as year-over-year growth. Year-over-year, year-to-date, we're up about 35% in our butter sale. Margarine is up under 20, so butter is doing better, which of course makes us, and it may surprise you, all the years we got beat up, total volume of butter is actually much greater than margarine. And what we have found is that the number of people that even make margarine has declined. It's harder to find people to make it, which as a dairy guy doesn't really break my heart. But that is the case. And butter still remains strong. We promoted butter more heavily because butter costs were lower. And we don't generally change our retail prices, but promotions are affected by cost of goods. And so with butter in that 150, 170 range for most of the year, a little lower, of course, in April and May, we've been very aggressive on our butter sales. And that's one of the reasons I think sales have remained strong. During the COVID period, butter sales were up, and in my case, it was the 2 months, up 55%. Huge growth, and across the category. Specialty as well as regular butter. Of course, regular value butter is a much larger category. So again, strong there. Ice cream, same thing. I think people didn't go out, so they enjoyed their ice cream at home. We're up 10% for the year. Novelties were up 14%. We've had some trouble with novelties. We would argue our sales would be better, and I think most supermarket chains would tell you the same thing. We had a significant impact of COVID on a lot of the novelty specialty plants. That has affected availability of product, and so we've all struggled, and yet we're still up 13% for the year. And in the case of novelties, up 13% the last 4 weeks. Ice cream is weaker, but that's because we had a promotion a year ago we didn't have this year, a big promotion, so it's still up 7%. So our sales are up. What's interesting is our overall sale of grocery sales. I looked at the units of dairy versus units of groceries. It's pretty flat. It's at 15%. It was at 14.8 for the year, but it was actually lower during COVID. And I think kind of to John's point, we saw, again, units. During COVID, we saw larger packages selling better. People wanted 2 pounds of cheese. People wanted to buy a lot of frozen things. We definitely saw that. They wanted stuff that had the long shelf life. We saw that with cheese as well, to John's point. Looking at basically Velveeta or Kroger's equivalent, which is called Nice and Cheesy, which is a plug is made in Wisconsin, Corey, so you can share that with your local folks there. And that is the loaves are up during COVID. We're up 46%. Year to date, they're still up 22. They have slowed down. Other thing is Parmesan, just canned Parmesan. We all know that keeps for a long time. That was up 40, and it remains very, very high. It's still up 40. So we're selling a lot of Parm as well. So we've seen a lot of strength. The one area, along with yogurt, and we'll talk about yogurt first. What we have seen is a shift. It's pretty obvious that people are taking yogurt to work because the work at home crowd isn't doing that. And we have seen a shift from the multi-packs to multi-serve, where meaning instead of buying the 4 counts or the single counts, they're buying quarts. The trend toward Greek away from conventional yogurt is continuing, but there definitely is, again, people are home, they're buying the larger packs. I know in the case of my household, that is certainly the case. The other thing that we're seeing, though, overall with yogurts is that the high-end yogurts have slowed down. Kind of the indulgent, the fancy glass bottle yogurts, in our case anyway, have slowed down. People are going a bit back to the basics. We'll talk about that in a minute as far as within Kroger. But the other category that has been weak is snacking cheese. And you think about those little packs of cheese with maybe some nuts and fruit, or just even to some degree string cheese, although it is improving again. What we have seen is things that people take out of the home with them. They take the cheese in the car when they drive, or they pack it in the kids' lunchbox. Those have slowed down, but they've been more and made up by the other cheese categories, and the really strong ones have been, again, with trend, is shredded cheese, been incredibly strong, and during COVID, processed singles as well. They've slowed down some, but they continue to be strong. Last 4 weeks, we have to be cognizant we haven't had any promotions, so that can skew your numbers over a shorter period of time. So overall, we've had great growth in dairy. It is sustained, definitely sustained as we move into the season. One of our biggest challenges is for next year is to figure out how much stuff we're going to sell as we contract for supplies, both of raw products for our plants as well as for finished products that we buy prepackaged with Kroger labels. And so let's talk about that for a second. Has COVID affected what people are looking for as far as cost, quality? Well, the big thing is size. One of the biggest things we see with our consumers, they're going to the grocery store less, but they're buying a lot more when they go. So they tend to buy both larger sizes and have more units in their shopping cart when they check out. So our 2-pound bags of cheese, for example, Kroger brand, are selling, their share of the market has grown versus the smaller amounts. So some of these unit numbers are a little bit deceiving because the unit size actually, particularly in cheese, have gotten larger. The other thing that we see is they still want quality. We certainly have that value shopper who's looking for the lower cost items. Kroger basically has 4 levels. The main level, our main brand is Kroger, and that is what we consider our equivalent to national brand products. We have Private Selection, which is a little more of a decadent brand. We're coming out, for example, some new kind of call them gourmet, but some special shred mixes that are going to be Private Selection coming out later actually mid next year. And then we have Simple Truth, which isn't necessarily organic, but it's natural. And there's certain rules that have to be met to be those products. Private Selection and Simple Truth both continue to grow at a faster rate than Kroger, mind you, off a smaller base. But Simple Truth is now $1 billion brand in Kroger stores. It's a big part of our business. And that will continue, and dairy is well represented in that. Most of the dairy in Simple Truth is organic, but it is well represented. But as far as the Private Selection, that, for example, our higher fat ice creams are our Private Selection. They've done extremely well this year. So people still are looking for that little treat. And so it's followed all of dairy moving up. So we haven't seen people go, you always talk about in a recession, people all go to the economic low cost. So there's certainly some of that. But what I think makes this recession a little different is so disparate on how it affects people. As far as, I'm working from home, but my salary didn't drop. And so I'm basically saving gas, I guess you could say, although I'm also dealing with a crazy dog who thankfully today has been quiet. But so my grocery habits haven't changed other than we don't eat out anymore. So we cook more, just like a lot of people. There's folks at the other end, and we continue to try to provide that value end of the product, because one thing Kroger tries to do is meet all customer needs, and that has also grown. But overall, on dairy, we're feeling confident about the future. It does appear, we've had those 3 to 5% decreases in annual consumption of milk. We're still remaining, the last few weeks, we're still up on fluid milk consumption. So we're hopeful that we're going to level out. Hopefully some people have rediscovered it. But back to just quickly on market share, if you look at our total dairy category in units, the only category that has significantly lost share is actually yogurts. As far as its share of the total units we sell, fluid milk is actually up slightly. That's because it's up overall. And the rest of them are pretty well flat, but we always talk about how yogurt stole from the fluid folks because people quit eating cereal and started eating yogurt. Well, maybe they're buying more Cheerios again too, because milk is a little more stable. So that's what we're seeing. As a dairy guy, I'm excited about, and for our plants, our 19 dairy plants, I'm excited that there seems to be very strong demand for dairy, even post the urgency of the on COVID. And as we continue to struggle with COVID and people eat at home, I think dairy's got a good strength, and we need it because we got to make up for the loss of food service sales as an industry.
Thank you, Mike. We have a number of questions coming in. So as you hear ideas that you want to ask our panelists, go ahead and type them into the panel. We're going to go to our third guest here. As a reminder, I'd like to thank our friends at Diamond V for sponsoring today's dairy live stream. And before we hear from Andy Novakovic, let's go to our final poll question. Jim, go ahead and put that on the screen. What % of the U.S. milk supply did the federal government buy this year? And this was really induced by some of the programs related to the pandemic. And that included predominantly USDA's food box buying programs. But your answers are 0 to 2%, 3 to 5%, 10 to 12%, or 13 to 15%. So we're getting people to vote here. Over 50% have voted, and they're trending to the right answer, Andy. And we'll go ahead and cut that poll off and welcome Andy back to Dairy Livestream. Andy, consumers are demanding dairy. Can you help tie together John and Mike's observations for those of us on the farm and those of us working with farmers? And the correct answer to that poll question was B, 3 to 5%. And it, that takes some math, and it's not a perfect answer there, but it's a range. So Andy?
Yeah, so what I'm going to try to do is a couple things. One is John and Mike understand the full breadth of dairy markets, but their ask this morning was to really focus on the retail side. And so what I'd like to do is round that out a little bit by kind of looking at the total. And the other thing that I'm going to try to do is see if I can find a few nuggets in this story. And I have to say, or will say anyway, that if you talk to most people in the industry, especially producers, and you say what's going on in dairy markets, pretty soon they're telling you what's happening to the price of milk or what's going on in the exchange. And that's really the kind of the barometer for what's going on. It's this much higher, that much lower. It's different from what you expected. But when you talk to people like Mike or John or Mark Stevenson and say, hey, what's going on in dairy markets? The next thing you know, you're on page 5 of your yellow pad and you forgot what the question was. It's just there's so much detail. And I think both of those observations are relevant. The fact of the matter is, it's a little bit like the old story about a duck. You see gliding serenely across the lake or the river, and what you don't see is the legs paddling furiously underneath. The dairy industry looks like it's a 1.2% this and 0.9% that, and it's well, so what? And yet these really small changes, whether they're up or down or a little below trend or above trend, can have a really big effect on prices. And so these little individual stories about what's yogurt doing, 2% milk and blah, 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 actually are pretty important, but it's almost impossible to keep track of all that. So I'm going to try to go through some major product categories and see if I can distill some kind of talking points down. Fluid milk, USDA data, which is not quite national, but boy, it's really close to national, is showing 2020 through August, up 1.4% relative to 2019. Now remember, fluid milk has been trending down. In fact, per capita has been like completely falling off the table, and total has been pretty sick since 2010. So the fact that we're up over 2019, to me, it looks like, woof, this is a pretty big deal. Interestingly, organic is up 14%, conventional is up 0.6%. Of course, conventional is a much bigger number than organic, but I think perhaps part of that story is some of the people who are drinking milk at home that weren't drinking milk, or were maybe not as much when they were going to work or school or whatever, are choosing to upgrade. I would say that's how they would view it, towards organic. American cheese, production's doing this, commercial is doing that, trade's doing this. The nugget I'm going to give you is for American cheese, which is cheddar kinds of cheeses, is donations. We're donating a lot of cheese. The boxes that people are picking up have a lot of cheeses. There are additional other programs that aren't the Farmers to Families food box that also are moving cheese. And reports from the industry are pretty clear that this is having really potent effects on prices for wholesale prices for cheese, which of course end up reflecting into class 3 prices. So American cheese, I'm going to say donations are probably the thing that sticks out. Other styles of cheese, the big one, of course, is mozzarella, but there's Hispanic and the kind of cheeses we might see in a deli, provolone, snacking cheeses that we don't eat a lot of it at any one point in time, but they're kind of fun to have on a tray, like say maybe an Asiago or a fancy French cheese. Those cheeses, I'm going to say that the story there is mostly about domestic consumption. These are not cheeses that are really big for us in trade. They're also not really big for us in donations. So we started donating cheeses well before the pandemic as part of the trade facilitation thing. But over the last year or so, we've donated 17 million pounds of American style cheese to of other cheese. So donations are not as big a deal for that. And as kind of Mike was saying, that's the category that's been most disrupted in terms of domestic sales. If we look at butter, again, there's various different stories. Remember, butter was a product that butter is a thing by itself, but it's also reflecting the value of cream in other cream-like products, as Mike was talking about with these things that we tend to put in our coffees and Starbucks and so on. And that value of milk fat, value of cream-based products that we see reflected in butter has been a big part of our attention. Price of butter has been crazy high in recent years, but not so much right now. The story on butter that I would say, the punchline I would point out, is stocks, particularly stocks relative to total demand. Stocks is a share of demand. Pre-pandemic, stocks relative to demand on butter were a bit less than normal. Post, they are much higher. So basically what we're seeing is all these adjustments in what we eat, where we eat it, and so on, is backing up into folks, mostly co-ops, but not exclusively, making more butter that they don't really have a market to sell. It's not a product that we easily sell overseas. And if the commercial market doesn't take it, it ends up in a refrigerated warehouse. Okay. Net. Well, what do we got? Basically, the answer to the question, is milk consumption up or down, or dairy product consumption up or down? From February through August of 2020, compared to those same months in 2019, total dairy sales are up 0.7% on a fat basis, 0.8% on a skim basis, call it 0.75. So sales are up. That includes exports for the stuff we export, and exports have been pretty important. I mentioned them as a category of things to pay attention to. Some of it is domestic sales. The fluid milk is contributing to that. But net, the impact on dairy product sales total has been positive during this pandemic period, which might be a little surprising to some folks. However, the thing we got to pay attention to is how does that compare to increases in production? And if you look at production numbers in the last few months, they are trending more and more upward. I think the last one was 2.5%. So right now, I would say markets are still struggling to figure out what's up, what's down, what's going to stay, what isn't going to stay. I call it turbulence. But one of the bigger dominating market effects has been these donation programs, the food box in particular. But we need to be wary about the fact that the underlying fundamental is that production is starting to increase faster than demand, and actually not by a small amount. In normal times, these relative changes, both are going up, but production is going up faster, to me would signal concern about future milk prices. And it begs the question, how much longer can we expect the federal government to be subsidizing food consumption for low-income families? USDA continues to be fairly bullish on the farm price, but they're looking at a 2021 forecast, which is still early days, as the Brits would say, that's weaker than 2020. And the 2020 price that they're forecasting, although I'm going to characterize it as bullish, isn't as high on average as it was in 2019. Close. So that's my around the table summary on a few highlights and reminding folks that it's all going to back up into prices just as it always does. Thanks, Greg.
You really tied everybody's comments together well. John and Mike had some great insight, and thanks for bringing that home. A reminder to our audience, you can go ahead and type in your questions. We have a number of questions in here, and our first question is going to come from Matt, and I think he was in our dress rehearsal. I'm going to go with Matt's question here, but to categorize it a little bit, what we talked about yesterday, he asks, do you think dairy sales can maintain their momentum into the next year? And obviously, we've been candidly joking about forecasts because they change every day. During this pandemic, you have a plan for the week, you crumble it up, throw it out, and start over again because things change that quickly. But to frame this for our panelists here, predicting dairy prices has been darn tough, to be candid. And part of that is due to the government spending on dairy. And so what does buying look like for dairy moving into the next year? And quite frankly, how do we gracefully wean off of government purchasing? If we say on the low side at 3% they've been buying federally, or high side 5%, and you go at those numbers Andy just said here, we're going to have some more market volatility coming up. I don't know what panelist wants to dig that first here, but again, the main question is, do you think dairy sales can maintain their momentum in the next year?
So let me just jump in real quick. No, they can't. But in general, it'll depend on the shift between food service and retail, right? So how quickly do we get our restaurants all completely open? I think that when you talked about, when Andy looked at the numbers, you think about the milk sales, right? We're seeing pretty good growth with milk within retail, but now you're talking about schools and the lack of, kids at school drinking milk. So that's certainly going to be an impact on that. So I would say retail, I think we will maintain, some semblance of higher volumes than we did prior to the pandemic. But it's not going to, obviously we're going to be wrapping on ridiculously high numbers, and that's going to certainly be a challenge. And then as, I always said, is this going to be a great recession like we had in 2008, where, us as Americans have a very easy, we're very quick to forget, right? Or is this going to be a Great Depression, where my grandparents, pinched pennies for the rest of their entire lives? So I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to see how much of these new behaviors actually kind of continue to take hold with consumers eating at home and cooking at home and not eating out as much. So I would say no, we probably can't continue the growth, but again, depending on what happens with that shift between retail and food service, certainly food service is going to come back stronger than they are today.
Mike?
I would agree with that. We think we'll continue to have a lift, and I think a big part of that is what happens with how we can manage COVID. It was an article this morning on a scientist from Britain talking about it's going to go from a pandemic to an endemic, which means like flu, it'll probably be around every year. We'll never totally get rid of it. How effective vaccines are, I think, are all big players in what we see moving ahead. I think the other thing is also consumer income. Because a lot of the sales lift this year was supported by the COVID benefits out of the early bills that were passed. People use that, they shopped with that. They don't have it now. We're frankly surprised things have held up as well as they have the last month since those dollars went away. And so what's that consumer pocketbook going to look like? We think it's going to be continue to be challenged, particularly with folks, the service industries, which those people have lost their jobs maybe forever. And again, back to Andy's comments on government purchases are huge. I can't imagine what we're going to do next year as far as budget for not just dairy, for all of agriculture. What the implications of that might be to grow sales, because that 3 to 5% the government has bought has been a huge lift on the cheese market. There's no question about it. It's affected how we're promoting. Frankly, we don't change prices generally, list prices. We promote more when prices go down. In cheese right now we're doing a lot more butter compared to history than we are cheese, because the way we promote, we would lose a lot of money actually at the prices we normally promote cheese at. So I am not super optimistic. I look at the forward buy in the futures market as a buyer of products, and I think it's optimistic. If I was a producer, I'd be looking at those closely, because the other part of production, again, a lot of it's milk per cow. As Corey knows well, because he's lived it, Upper Midwest dealt with dreadful feed last year. A lot of the country did. We've been dry late, but the quality of forage is really good. So I think we're going to have good productivity, which could put a little more pressure on. Also lowers cost of making milk. My dad always said, if you grow good forage, you buy less grain. But nonetheless, I think we're going to have, I don't see production, at least short term, slowing down. I think it's continue to be pretty good because of the milk per cow and the availability of good feed. The fires in the West haven't slowed things down a lot yet, but we'll see what happens with that.
Andy, anything to add?
Well, I'll just say this. I think this is the fate of prices and how this all looks is primarily in consumers' hands. And when you think about consumers, I think about what do they need, what do they want, and what can they afford? And we've been kind of focusing on things like need, where you get into lockdowns and that sort of thing. What they can afford, that kind of gets us into economy. These are big deals. What I want is a little bit tougher, but one of the real questions I've got is, now that I've figured out how to make bread and that I can actually cook something besides just throw somebody else's stuff into a microwave, is that going to stick? Is that going to change how I choose to eat? Am I going to go back to work and throw that yogurt in my purse and carry it in for lunch? Or are we going to all say, hey, this working at home is not so bad. I'm going to do more of it. I'm going to do a lot of it. That to me is a pretty serious question about which I don't think anybody can do anything except guess. The other one is production. And I think we're all well aware that the programs that primarily cooperatives have created to restrain production growth that were put into place in the early stages of the pandemic are still on the books, still on the table. And will there be any will to implement some of those programs, maybe not as draconian as they were? And if that were to happen, that could have a pretty potent effect. I do not want anybody putting my name down on a piece of paper as a proponent of supply management, but I'm just going to say those kind of choices could make a difference.
Well, we're going to go to a little bit of speed round here. We've got over a dozen questions that came rolling in here. There's a quick one here that we can answer. Comes from Steve. The question is, do milk sales include government giveaways by the government? And yes, I mean, those sales are included in the data. Is that not correct, Andy?
Yeah, well, the data allow you to include them or exclude them. So you can look at the individual pieces or you can look at the total. So when I talked about domestic sales, I wasn't including donations. When I talk about total sales, I do.
And that was what you were using on the fat and the skim powder base or skim milk basis.
Correct.
Yep. So that was
Correct.
0.75 up. This one is specifically for Mike here. Does Kroger have interest in expanding unique ESL? And I looked up the acronym. ESL is extended milk life products here for fluid milk.
Absolutely. There's a lack of processing capacity for ESL and aseptic beverage lines in the United States, and they're very expensive, which is one of the concerns. We actually buy more than we make. We have a dedicated ESL line in Kansas. We have a dedicated aseptic line in Denver, Colorado. That's where all of our creams are packaged in our single serve milks. We definitely do see that. The issue is capital. And I always joke at Kroger, it's more sexy to build a new grocery store than it is to put a production line in a plant. And so we're like everybody else. We have so much money, we have to allocate it the way that makes sense. We see that growth continuing. When we look at the growth of fluid milk, it's almost entirely in ESL products. Certainly some specialty, but even within conventional, people like that convenience of that longer shelf life.
John, this next question is going to come your way here. And have you seen a decrease in whey product supplements during the pandemic, or products that use a lot of whey? Or, what's the whey category look like? And I'll tell as John's thinking about that, I'll tell our other guests as we go through the speed round, if you have something that's very vital, add, jump in, but we'll make these single person questions. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for what's going on with whey supplements or whey products. I don't have an answer. I can certainly get that answer for you and get it back to you, but that's not a category that I look at regularly.
My old Glanbia friends say it's a little weak.
Okay. The next question, I think we'll start with Andy here. The wisdom used to be that we consume more dairy in out-of-home eating than we do at home. Does our COVID experience, including Andy's total consumption data, suggest we need to reevaluate the idea about at-home dairy consumption? Are we seeing a shift here? John talked a little bit about this maybe generational changing. It may not, but you got the gist of that question there. Is we're going to have to reevaluate how we look at home dairy consumption for consumers.
Yeah, well, the totality of what's consumed at home and what's consumed away from home, I think still actually favors at-home consumption. Although when you talk about something like cheese and butter, you start to see a lot of food service applications, recognizing this includes work cafeterias and schools and so on. Also, you got to be a little careful about the quantity consumed versus the amount of money you spend, because a pound of cheese in food service is a lot more expensive than a pound of cheese at home. But whatever those precise numbers are, it's very clear that food service is super important. I think one of the hopeful stories is dairy has done actually pretty well with curbside carryout takeaway sales. The pizza model has been the envy of everybody who's in the restaurant business as an established way to get a product from a commercial kitchen into your dining room table. So yeah, I think we got to pay attention to that going forward. I'm sure there's going to be some recovery, but I think it's going to be a while before it happens.
I think this next question, we're going to start with Mike, and then John might want to do some follow-up on that. Mike mentioned issues with the novelties and the supply chain. How does the supply chain look regarding packaging and other inputs to process the products, like the wrapping that goes around butter sticks or other things? What does that look like as you try to process dairy? And John, when I turn that over to you, what have you been hearing from other organizations? So Mike?
It was extremely tight mid-spring, COVID time, getting packaged. And what happened a lot is that inventories got depleted. So we had to not only sell in the strong market, we had to replenish supplies. Probably the best example of how a market versus form of a product is very butter, as Andy mentioned, we've had plenty of inventory. Butter had an inventory issue long before COVID. despite the fact of the use of butterfat in food service is, of course, extremely important. But we had a lack of consumer packaging capacity in butter. And what normally happens with butter, a lot of it is frozen and then rethawed. We call it tempered for the season, for the Christmas season. The butter makers have gotten very, very good at that. And so they freeze, up to a third of the demand for fourth quarter may be frozen, because demand fourth quarter is about double what it is the other 3 quarters of the year. And no one told the cows, no one told the guy that built the plant. So they try to do that ahead of time best they can. And we have struggled with that. And people didn't freeze butter ahead, because you have a lift of 30%. No one keeps a plant 30% open if they can help it. So it was going out the door. The saving grace, we had one co-op has built a retail butter, put in 2 retail butter lines since last June. Another large cooperative expanded their capacity in August. And the original hope was that was going to help us meet demand in the fall, but what it's really doing is making up for the frozen butter. So demand remains tight. We have bought capacity ahead so that we could be prepared, because we know we're going to be shortages. And there's been allocations, despite butter being relatively weak price. Packaged butter has been actually allocated in some cases due to lack of capacity.
Corey, could I just jump out with a little fact?
Okay.
Talking about butter, Mike mentioned butter's had a little bit of a stocks issue for a while. The United States of America has been a net importer of butter for the last 5 years. I don't know how many people have gone into the grocery store and failed to see that there's a pretty prominent section of usually Irish but European style butters. And we've got consumers that are enjoying the fact that they make their butter a little bit different and maybe from a little bit different kind of milk. Also, it's not so easy for us to sell butter in export markets. So that's a factor that's kind of unique to the butter market.
John?
Number 2 national brand is imported.
Just a quick little bit of a different take on this is, if you think about how manufacturers have had to ramp up their production on their biggest selling items, and what that has meant towards some of the other items that they might have. So butter is going to produce butter quarters, right? And they're not going to be producing as much, honey butter or whipped butter or some of those products as they're shifting production, they're shifting supply. So what does that do to assortment on shelf, and what does that do as we start to get back to some sense of normalcy? Does that start to shift back towards those other packages and cranking those back up? I think the other thing is, and I talked about this to milk suppliers for many years. You think about what Fairlife did with that package, and the extended shelf life, the amount of communication that they can do on that package. And then you think about a gallon of milk with a sticker on it. I've always said there's a huge lost opportunity within the fluid dairy on conventional milk to not be communicating on that package. So I would say that there is some innovation that should happen, particularly with extended shelf life. I think that, as Mike already talked about, and I think that there's some opportunities here. There's certainly some opportunities within yogurt to do some rationalization and kind of, make that aisle a little simpler. I always like to say I'm in the category and I can't figure that aisle out either.
Well, we make it. We'd love it to be simpler.
We're getting a number of questions in here on futures and hedging, and I want to tell all our guests here that the November 4th program is going to be taking a position on milk prices. So we're going to save those questions for that panel, because that will be a specific category there. Andy, this is a loaded question here, and we got about 6 minutes left in the broadcast, but the question comes in: given the importance of exports in U.S. dairy pricing and profitability, would a panelist give a high level overview of how the 2 prospective future administrations, we're talking about presidential candidates here, may view the importance of egg exports, thus their level of support for policy in that area? Loaded question for...
Well, thank you for the opportunity to comment on that a couple of weeks before the election in a state that's decidedly purple. I would say, first of all, trade is very much determined by the actions of individual businesses, both buyers and sellers, and high-level government has an impact. But getting the dairy industry's act together to be effective marketers to foreign customers is the requirement number one. Number two, I'm going to go back to basic economics and say, anytime you put a tax on something, you will reduce economic activity. I think most dairy farmers probably can figure that out. If I put on a sales tax on something, I'm going to produce less of it and I'm going to sell less of it. And tariffs are a tax. And so to me, the real question is, what are the implications going forward? What kind of trade policy will we have in terms of tariff levels? And President Trump has made it clear that he believes that tariffs are an effective way to discipline people he doesn't like. And I think a President Biden would have a very different approach. And I think the economic result of that change of reducing or eliminating tariffs would be positive in terms of economic growth, dairy and otherwise.
Thank you, Andy. Question for John and Mike. In a recession, what kind of products typically suffer the most? And we're talking specifically dairy here.
So I'll jump in there real quickly. We've done a lot of work looking back at the 2008 recession and kind of what happened then and how that can provide some vision as to what might happen here in the future. One thing that we do see is we see lower end products, so the less costly products do well, and we also see indulgent products, so premium products do well. Where we see the challenge in those mid-range products. So we could think about the half gallons of ice cream or something along those lines versus the pints and versus the bigger packages. One other thing that we also see is consumers, when they are economically strapped, and particularly with SNAP consumers, they're actually looking for lower price points. So they're not looking to buy in bulk. They're not looking to buy 2-for-1. They don't want to spend that kind of money. So if you can have some assortment that has an actual lower price point, because they're living week to week, they're living food stamp to food stamp. So keep that in mind as well. But generally we see the low end and the high end do well, and kind of the mid range really kind of struggle.
Well, we got a couple more questions here. We'll see if we can't squeeze them in. This one's coming to you, Mike, and I know with your background you might be able to answer it, but from a policy perspective, does Kroger believe that the Class 1 formula change has been beneficial to your ability to hedge or predict Class 1 fluid milk on your side? Is this something you utilize? And obviously the change has been debated, I guess, in dairy community, whether it's been beneficial on the farm gate. Is that enough information to grab that one?
It is, and I won't be so popular perhaps. We think it has helped. It's particularly helped with your products where you want to have a longer term shelf stable price. Some of those ESL, some of those high protein products with a higher skim cost, it gives us that ability to do that. The frustration we have is that you can't do it with your seller. You can't forward buy. I can forward buy Class 2 fat for ice cream all day long from my supplier. I can't forward buy Class 1 skim, because that's regulated order. I have to go outside the system to do it, which makes it cumbersome. We think the formula is an improvement, and I would remind folks, the reason right now there's a lot of frustration with the formula is because we have so spiked the price of cheese due to the government purchase program that it's created an inequity between Class 3 and Class 4. I'd say the same thing for some of our good Midwest borough cheese processors, and a couple of really excellent ones. Who have suffered because the barrel block spread has gotten very, very wide. When you regulate, you create winners and losers. You're not competing against the market. You're competing against a regulated price, which you have no control over. And so all of that causes frustration. So we think the formula works. We're supportive of it long term. When it first came into effect, we were paying more for milk. This year, since COVID, we've been paying less because what happened with the cheese market. So I think it's important people recognize I can take 6 months of anything and make it look good or bad. I used to work for national milk producers, and good economists know which data to use. But now that I'm in the market and have been for more than 20 years, I think it's important that we recognize the importance of some stability. The other thing is, how much fluid milk we're going to sell if we have a $35 Class 1 milk price. I mean,
we're going to take one more question, and we're running low on time here. This is really a follow-up to John's comment or answer. Won't this be a different kind of recession? It isn't so much a loss of asset value, which affects the wealthy more. This is a loss of jobs and income on folks with modest means. And Andy's making some motions there. Maybe he wants to take that.
Hugely different. 2009 was an attack on capital. This is an attack on labor, and it's affecting people tremendously. You can have people of fairly ordinary means whose mortgage was upside down in 2009, and I don't diminish that, but it's an entirely different situation with different kinds of people being affected in different ways.
Well,
sorry, let me just jump in real quick. So yes, it's different. And there's a lot of differences. You know, you think about online ordering is completely different. You think about the value channel of, you know, the Aldis and the Lidls of the world and how big they've gotten and how many more stores they've gotten. So it is different. However, I would say that that consumer confidence is still going to, you know, take a shot here. And that absolutely happened back in 2008. Consumer confidence, you know, really did take a shot. And you know, some of the younger workers also saw that impact, which you're going to see here as well. And again, it depends on how quickly we can reopen this economy, and particularly in the food service side of it, to see, you know, how quickly we can kind of rebound here. But right now, it is very different. You're absolutely right. But there are things we can learn from what happened then to what we expect to happen now.
Well, that wraps up our program here. I'm so pleased to have had John and Mike and Andy here. November 4th, the conversation will continue. The title of that webcast will be Taking a Position on Milk Prices. We'd like to again thank our sponsors here, Diamond V. We didn't get to all the questions, but we went through as many as we could. We had a lot of thoughtful questions from our viewers this week. Thank you to Jim Baltz, our producer, Caitlin Allen, and Kristen Brogy here. And I'm Corey Geiger signing off. This is Dairy Livestream, and thank you for joining us. Have a great week, everyone.